He woke alone that morning in 1947, like every other morning for the past 10 years, inside a castle that seemed to have been plucked from the hills of medieval Spain and transplanted to a mountaintop in California. The walls around him were decorated with tapestries that had belonged to European kings. The ceiling above his bed was gilded with genuine gold. The windows overlooked gardens that stretched for hectares, where zebras imported from Africa grazed freely among authentic Greek sculptures over 2,000 years old. He possessed one of the largest private fortunes in the Western world. His name was synonymous with absolute power in America. He was William Randolph Hearst, the man who had built a media empire that shaped the public opinion of an entire nation. And that morning, at 83 years old, as he watched the sun rise over that absurd palace he himself had created, he felt something that none of his millions of dollars could ever buy back: the presence of another person who truly cared, whether he woke up or not. The castle was silent. His guests had stopped coming. His legendary parties were just memories. Marion, the only woman he had truly loved, was far away, living on another estate, kept at a distance by his lawyers and his children, who had always despised her. And there, surrounded by treasures that kings would envy, encircled by art that museums would kill to possess, William Randolph Hearst realized something terrifying. He had built the most luxurious prison in the world, and he was its only prisoner. This is not just the story of a rich man. This is the story of how extreme wealth can turn into a silent curse, how absolute power can create a void so deep that not even palaces can fill it, how the obsession with controlling everything can result in losing what truly matters. This is the story of Hearst Castle, one of the most extravagant properties ever built by human hands, and of the man who dedicated 3 decades of his life and an incalculable fortune to erecting a monument to his own greatness, only to discover too late that he had built his own mausoleum. If you want to continue receiving cinematic, dark, and deeply human stories like this one, stories about extreme wealth, power, and decadence that are created to be felt and reflected upon, subscribe to the channel now. It's the only way to guarantee you won't miss the upcoming narratives that reveal the hidden side of luxury and the silent price of absolute power. William Randolph Hearst was born in 1863 in San Francisco, the only child of George Hearst, a miner who had become brutally wealthy during the California gold rush. George was a rough, uneducated man who understood rocks, land, and how to extract fortune from the bowels of America. His wife, Phoebe Apperson Hearst, was the complete opposite: refined, educated, obsessed with European culture, and determined to transform her only son into something his father could never be: a sophisticated gentleman, a man of power not only financially, but culturally and politically. It was in this tension between the rough and the refined, between the father's dirty pragmatism and the mother's aristocratic obsession, that William Randolph Hearst was shaped. He grew up in palaces, traveled through Europe before the age of 10, and was exposed to art, architecture, and luxury that most people would never see in their lives. But he also grew up observing how money bought everything: respect, influence, silence, power. At 23, after being expelled from Harvard for a series of elaborate pranks that humiliated his professors, Hearst convinced his father to give him control of a failing San Francisco newspaper, the San Francisco Examiner. And it was there, in that decaying newspaper that nobody read, that William Randolph Hearst discovered his true calling: not just to report reality, but to create it. Hearst transformed the Examiner into a machine of brutal sensationalism. He wasn't interested in dry facts or balanced journalism. He wanted headlines that would burn readers' eyes, stories that would provoke outrage, scandals that would sell millions of copies. He hired the best writers, paid exorbitant salaries, sent reporters to dangerous places, and invented stories when reality wasn't dramatic enough. And it worked. The Examiner exploded in popularity. In less than a decade, Hearst had transformed a dying newspaper into one of the most influential on the West Coast. But he didn't stop there. He bought the New York Journal and declared war on rival magnate Joseph Pulitzer, owner of the New York World. What followed was one of the dirtiest battles in the history of American journalism, a race to the bottom, where each headline needed to be more shocking, more violent, more scandalous than the last. Hearst and Pulitzer competed to see who could manufacture more public outrage, who could manipulate more emotions, who could sell more fear. And in the process, they didn't just sell millions of newspapers, they helped push the United States toward war. In 1898, when the American battleship USS Maine mysteriously exploded in Havana Harbor, Cuba, killing over 200 sailors, no one knew exactly what had caused the explosion. It could have been an accident. It could have been a mechanical failure. But Hearst wasn't interested in careful investigations. He wanted war. His newspapers splashed incendiary headlines blaming Spain for the explosion, demanding revenge, inflaming American nationalist sentiment to hysterical levels. Hearst commissioned artists to draw brutal illustrations of Spanish atrocities, many of which never happened. He published fabricated stories of American heroism and Spanish cruelty. He turned the destruction of the Maine into a national rallying cry, and it worked. Public pressure forced the American government to declare war on Spain. The Spanish-American War lasted only a few months, but it solidified the United States as a global imperial power and cemented Hearst as the man who could literally start wars with his headlines. He had proven to himself and to the world that his influence was greater than that of politicians, generals, or diplomats. He controlled what people thought. He controlled reality, and this power completely intoxicated him. In the following years, Hearst expanded his media empire aggressively and ruthlessly. He bought newspapers in virtually every major American city: Chicago, Boston, Los Angeles, Atlanta, Detroit, Pittsburgh. At the height of his power, he controlled 28 daily newspapers, 18 magazines, film studios, radio stations, and international news agencies. His publications reached over 20 million readers daily. He wasn't just a media mogul, he was the media mogul. He shaped elections, destroyed political careers, elevated unknowns to stardom, and ruined reputations with the same ease with which he breathed. And the more power he accumulated, the more he felt he deserved to live like the kings and emperors he so admired. He didn't just want to be rich, he wanted to be immortal. He wanted to leave a mark on the earth that would last for centuries. And that's how the idea for the castle was born. In 1919, at the age of 56, Hearst inherited 67,000 acres of land atop a secluded mountain in San Simeon, California, a property his father had purchased decades earlier as a cattle ranch. The property lay halfway between Los Angeles and San Francisco, surrounded by arid hills and spectacular views of the Pacific Ocean. It was remote, wild, and utterly magnificent. And Hearst looked at that mountain and decided that there, in that impossible place, he would build something the world had never seen. He didn't want a mansion, he didn't want a cottage, he wanted a castle. He wanted a palace to rival Versailles. He wanted to create his own private utopia, a private kingdom where he would reign like a medieval king, surrounded by art, luxury, and unimaginable beauty, and he wanted it to last forever. Hearst hired Julia Morgan, one of the few female architects of the time, who had studied at the prestigious École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. Julia was brilliant, meticulous, and, crucially, willing to tolerate Hearst's impossible personality and his absurd and constantly changing demands. Their working relationship would last 28 years, one of the longest continuous construction projects in American history. And from the beginning, it was clear that this would not be a normal architectural project. Hearst didn't just want a beautiful structure. He wanted to create a statement of power, a monument to his own greatness that would impress future generations. He began traveling through Europe, with professional buyers scouring ruined castles, abandoned churches, decaying palaces, forgotten monasteries, buying literally anything that could be removed and transported back to California. Hearst bought entire ceilings from 16th century Spanish churches, carefully stripped them stone by stone, numbered each piece, packed everything into giant crates, and shipped them across the Atlantic to be reconstructed in San Simeon. He bought carved wooden doors from Italian palaces, Roman columns from archaeological ruins, Greek statues from private museums, marble floors from French cathedrals, Renaissance frescoes from Tuscan villas. He bought complete Baroque fountains, including all the piping and internal mechanisms. He bought stained glass windows from medieval abbeys. He bought Egyptian sarcophagi, Etruscan vases, knights' armor, 15th century Flemish tapestries, illuminated manuscripts, paintings by old masters. If something had historical or artistic value or simply looked impressive, Hearst bought it. He didn't care about price. He didn't care about logistics. He didn't care if European museum curators protested or if governments tried to block exports. He simply paid more, bribed whoever was necessary, and took what he wanted. In a particularly absurd moment, Hearst bought a complete 12th century Cistercian monastery in Spain called Santa Maria de Ovila. He literally bought the entire monastery. Every stone was numbered, every arch was disassembled, every column was catalogued. More than 10,000 pieces were packed into crates and shipped to the United States. The plan was to reconstruct the monastery stone by stone in San Simeon. But when the crates arrived, American health authorities suspected that the hay used as packing material might be contaminated with foot-and-mouth disease. They ordered everything unpacked, the hay burned, and the stones stacked haphazardly. The numbered markings were lost. The assembly instructions were destroyed. Thousands of 12th century monastery stones sat piled up in California warehouses for decades, impossible to reconstruct because no one knew how they fit together anymore. It was a logistical disaster of epic proportions, but for Hearst, it was just another irritating detail in a project that was already so absurdly expensive that a few $100,000 wasted made no difference. Construction at San Simeon began in 1919 and never truly finished. For 28 years, hundreds of workers lived permanently on the mountain, building, demolishing, rebuilding, expanding, modifying. Hearst constantly changed his mind. An entire wing would be built, and then he would decide he didn't like the orientation and order it demolished and rebuilt facing another direction. He would see a picture of a palace in a magazine and order Julia Morgan to incorporate elements of that palace into the design. He would wake up in the middle of the night with an idea and send telegrams demanding immediate changes. Julia Morgan produced hundreds of architectural drawings, thousands of pages of technical specifications, countless revisions. She constantly traveled between her office in San Francisco and the construction site at San Simeon, spending days on the road, overseeing every detail, translating Hearst's impossible fantasies into real structures that obeyed the laws of physics. And slowly, over decades, something extraordinary began to emerge from the top of that mountain. The main structure was called La Casa Grande, a mansion of over 6,000 square meters with 115 rooms, including 38 bedrooms, 42 bathrooms, 19 living rooms, a gigantic library, a billiard room, a movie projection room, a dining room that could accommodate 50 guests at a single table, and countless corridors, galleries, and transitional spaces. The facade was a chaotic mix of architectural styles: towers that imitated the bell towers of Spanish churches, balconies reminiscent of Moorish palaces, facades that replicated Gothic cathedrals. It made no stylistic sense whatsoever, but somehow it worked because the scale was so absurd, so exaggerated, so blatantly megalomaniacal that it transcended the normal rules of good taste. Around the big house, Hearst built 3 separate guest houses, each large enough to be a mansion in itself. There was Casa del Mar, overlooking the ocean, decorated with authentic Spanish tiles and Renaissance furniture. There was Casa del Monte, perched atop a hill, with walls covered in medieval tapestries. There was Casa del Sol, bathed in Californian light, with Italian marble floors and frescoes on the walls. Each guest house had its own bedrooms, bathrooms, living rooms, and private balconies. And then there were the gardens. The gardens of Hearst Castle were an impossible botanical delight. He imported palm trees from Egypt, cypresses from Italy, cedars from Lebanon, olive trees from Greece. He built monumental fountains surrounded by statues of Greek and Roman gods. He created terraces with spectacular views of the ocean and mountains. And everywhere, roaming freely among the ancient sculptures and formal gardens, were exotic animals. Hearst had created a private zoo that, at its peak, housed over 300 animals of 100 different species: lions, tigers, leopards, bears, ostriches, flamingos, kangaroos, zebras, giraffes, antelopes, monkeys, parrots. He built elaborate enclosures for the predators, but allowed many of the herbivores to roam freely around the property. Visitors frequently encountered zebras grazing alongside 2,000-year-old Greek sculptures, kangaroos leaping among Baroque fountains, and ostriches running through Renaissance gardens. It was surreal, absurd, and completely magical. But the true jewels of the castle were the swimming pools. Hearst built two of the most extravagant pools ever created. The outdoor pool, called the Neptune Pool, was a masterpiece of classical design. An Olympic-sized pool surrounded by white marble colonnades, decorated with statues of marine deities, with a Greek temple facade as a backdrop. The pool itself measured over 30 meters in length and contained approximately 300,000 gallons of heated water. The edges were covered with Italian marble mosaics. The bottom was decorated with intricate patterns in natural stone. And surrounding everything was a marble terrace with authentic sculptures from ancient Rome. It was like swimming in a reconstructed Greek temple atop a Californian mountain. The indoor pool, called the Roman Pool, was even more spectacular. Completely covered and illuminated by natural light filtered through translucent glass windows. The pool was lined from floor to ceiling with over 1 million Venetian glass tiles in shades of blue and gold, creating a hypnotic visual effect that made the water seem to glow with its own light. The vaulted ceiling was covered with intricate geometric patterns that mimicked Byzantine mosaics. Golden lamps hung like jewels. The sound of water echoed softly off the walls. Swimming there was like being inside a giant jewel, submerged in blue and gold light, surrounded by beauty so intense it almost hurt. Guests who swam in the Roman pool often emerged in silence, unable to process what they had just experienced. And as construction progressed year after year, Hearst began to use the castle for what he truly desired: to impress. From the mid-1920s onward, Hearst Castle became the epicenter of American elite social life. Weekends at the castle were legendary, events that lasted for days, where Hollywood celebrities, industrial magnates, powerful politicians, famous writers, film directors, international stars, and European aristocrats mingled at parties that seemed straight out of movies. Charlie Chaplin was a frequent visitor. Cary Grant swam in the Neptune Pool. Greta Garbo strolled through the gardens. Winston Churchill dined in the Great Hall. George Bernard Shaw debated philosophy in the library. Clark Gable, Joan Crawford, James Stewart, Errol Flynn, all were invited at some point. Hearst would send his private train to pick up guests in Los Angeles or San Francisco and take them to San Simeon, where cars transported them up the mountain to the castle. Weekend routines followed a peculiar pattern dictated by Hearst's eccentric habits. Guests arrived Friday afternoon and were installed in one of the guest houses or in rooms in the big house. Hearst usually appeared only for dinner, which was served promptly at 9 o'clock in the evening in the great dining room, beneath 16th-century religious frescoes and medieval banners hanging from the ceiling. The table was a chaotic mix of luxury and informality, jewel-encrusted silver plates, gold cutlery, but with Heinz ketchup and plain mustard placed directly on the table in their commercial packaging because Hearst liked simple American condiments. Rare vintage French champagne was served in crystal glasses alongside bottled sodas. Imported lobsters were served with hamburgers. Hearst liked this mix of sophistication and American simplicity, and no one dared question it. After dinner, the guests would gather in the private screening room, where Hearst would show the latest films from his own studios or Hollywood productions that hadn't yet been publicly released. He had access to virtually any film because his studios produced hundreds of them, and his industry contacts gave him privileged access. Often, the stars of the films were in the audience, watching their own work for the first time along with the other guests. After the films, there were conversations, drinks, card games, and walks through the illuminated gardens. Hearst usually retired around midnight, but the younger guests stayed up until dawn, swimming in the pools, exploring the grounds, and getting lost in the castle's endless corridors. But despite the apparent fun and glamour, there were strict rules. Hearst absolutely prohibited any alcoholic beverages in the guest rooms. All alcohol had to be consumed in the common areas under supervision. This rule was a remnant of prohibition, but Hearst maintained it even after its repeal, partly for control, and partly because he himself drank very little. Guests who violated the rule were discreetly asked not to return. Hearst also insisted that everyone arrive at dinner punctually. Being late was considered a serious offense, and there was an unwritten but universally understood rule. No one ever mentioned Marion Davies disrespectfully in Hearst's presence. Marion Davies was the real reason Hearst built the castle. He met her in 1915, when she was only 18 and working as a chorus girl on Broadway. Hearst was 52, married, and had 5 grown children. But when he first saw Marion, something in him changed irreversibly. She was beautiful, of course, with blonde hair, bright blue eyes, and a smile that lit up entire rooms. But it wasn't just her beauty that captivated him. Marion had a vital energy, a genuine joy, a capacity for laughter that Hearst, trapped in his own seriousness and ambition, had never been able to access. She made him feel young. She made him feel alive. And he fell in love with her with an intensity that surprised everyone, including himself. Hearst immediately began shaping Marion's career, using all his power and influence to transform her into a movie star. He financed films specifically for her, ensured she received the best roles, hired the best directors, ordered his newspapers to publish rave reviews, manipulated award ceremonies, and bought entire studios to give her complete creative control. Marion had genuine talent for comedy, but Hearst insisted on casting her in grand historical dramas where she seemed out of place and uncomfortable. He was so obsessed with proving she was a great dramatic actress that he sabotaged the films that truly showcased her best talents. And Marion, who sincerely loved Hearst, despite the age difference and the strangeness of the situation, accepted it all because she knew it made him happy. The castle was built for Marion. Every detail was designed to impress her, to create a magical world where they could live together away from the judgments of society. Hearst never divorced his wife, Millicent, who refused to grant a divorce and lived comfortably in New York with a generous allowance while publicly pretending the marriage still existed. But at San Simeon, Hearst and Marion lived as husband and wife, receiving guests together, presiding over dinners together, creating memories together. Marion brought life to the castle. She organized elaborate themed parties, costume balls, where guests appeared dressed as historical or mythological characters. She laughed loudly, danced until dawn, swam naked in the Neptune pool under the stars, filled the corridors with music and joy. Hearst, normally serious and controlling, relaxed in her presence. He smiled more. He allowed small transgressions of the rules. He seemed, for brief moments, genuinely happy. But even in those golden years of the 1920s and early 1930s, when the castle was at the height of its glory and the parties were legendary, there was something unsettling beneath the surface of all that luxury. Guests often commented that, despite all the beauty and extravagance, the castle had a strange, almost melancholic atmosphere. The corridors were too long, too quiet, the rooms were too large, too cold, the ancient statues stared with empty eyes. The religious frescoes depicted saints in agony. The medieval tapestries portrayed scenes of war and death. It was as if Hearst, in his obsession with accumulating beauty and art, had inadvertently created a mausoleum, a monument to mortality and the passage of time, instead of a palace of eternal joy. And then came the Great Depression. In 1929, when the stock market collapsed and the American economy went into freefall, Hearst initially believed he was immune. He had real wealth, newspapers, magazines, property, art, land, but he had spent so recklessly for so many decades, had expanded his empire so aggressively with borrowed money, had accumulated so much debt to finance the castle and his other megalomaniacal projects, that when his newspaper revenue plummeted and advertisers disappeared, the entire financial structure began to crumble. In the early 1930s, Hearst was spending approximately $15 million a year just to maintain his lifestyle, the equivalent of over $300 million today. He owned properties all over the world, a castle in Wales, a mansion on Long Island, an estate in Bavaria, a villa in California, apartments in New York, ranches in Mexico. He maintained a staff of thousands of employees. He continued to compulsively buy art. He financed Marion's expensive films. And while America sank into massive unemployment and economic despair, Hearst continued to live like a medieval king, completely disconnected from the reality that most people faced. But reality eventually caught up with him. In 1937, Hearst was forced to confront the brutal truth. He was bankrupt. His debts totaled more than $125 million, an astronomical sum. His creditors demanded payment. He was forced to sell. And what followed was one of the most painful liquidations in American history. Hearst had to sell newspapers he had built. He had to sell properties he loved. He had to sell art he had pursued for decades. Entire warehouses filled with treasures were auctioned off. Pieces he had bought from European palaces were sold to American museums. Statues he had installed in San Simeon were removed and sent to galleries. Tapestries were torn from the walls. Rare manuscripts were scattered among private collections. It was a devastating public humiliation. Construction on San Simeon stopped abruptly in 1937 and was never resumed. Julia Morgan finalized her architectural plans knowing they would never be implemented. The workers were laid off. The castle remained permanently unfinished, with planned wings that would never be built, projects that would never be realized. And Hearst, at 74 years old, was forced to confront the fact that his grand vision, his monument to immortality, would remain eternally incomplete. But the worst was yet to come. Hearst's children, who had always despised Marion and blamed her for squandering the family fortune, took control of the business. They began making decisions without consulting him. They treated him like a relic, a foolish old man who had ruined the empire that should have been theirs. And Marion, who had dedicated almost 30 years of her life to Hearst, who had sacrificed her own career to make him happy, began to realize that when he died, she would be left with nothing. She had no legal rights. She wasn't in the will. Hearst's official wife was still alive. The children hated her. Then Marion did something surprising. In 1947, at the age of 50, she left the castle. She moved to a separate property in Beverly Hills. She began to rebuild her independent life. And Hearst, now 83, ill and frail, was left alone in the castle he had built to impress her. William Randolph Hearst's final years were devastatingly sad. He wandered the castle corridors, accompanied only by nurses and a few loyal staff. The parties were over. The famous guests had stopped coming. Hollywood had moved on. World War II had changed the world in ways he couldn't fully comprehend. His newspapers, which once shaped American public opinion, were losing relevance to radio and television. His influence had evaporated. His power had vanished. And there he was, surrounded by more wealth and beauty than most people could imagine, living in one of the most spectacular places ever created, completely and utterly alone. He wrote letters to Marion constantly, begging her to return. She visited occasionally, but always left again, unable to bear the suffocating melancholy of the castle and the presence of Hearst's children, who treated her with barely disguised contempt. Hearst offered jewels, money, promises, anything to make her stay. But Marion knew that this was no longer a life. It was a vigil. It was waiting for a man to die in a mausoleum he himself had built. In 1947, Hearst's doctors insisted he move to a smaller house in Beverly Hills, closer to proper medical care. Hearst resisted, but was eventually forced to agree. He left San Simeon for the last time in May 1947, driven down the mountain in an ambulance. He looked back as the castle disappeared from view, knowing he would never return. And indeed, he never did. Hearst lived his last 4 years in Beverly Hills, increasingly frail, increasingly confused, trapped in memories of a power and glory that no longer existed. William Randolph Hearst died on August 14, 1951, at the age of 88. Marion Davies was by his side, holding his hand, whispering that she loved him. But as soon as Hearst took his last breath, his children threw Marion out of the house, literally. They ordered her to leave immediately. She wasn't even allowed to attend the funeral. After almost 40 years together, after having dedicated her life to him, Marion was treated like an intruder, an inconvenience to be removed. Hearst's will made no mention of Marion. Legally, she wasn't entitled to anything, but Marion didn't need his money. Over the years, she had wisely invested the generous gifts Hearst had given her. She had her own fortune. And unlike Hearst, she lived her final years surrounded by genuine friends, people who loved her for who she was and not for what she possessed. Marion Davies died in 1961, 10 years after Hearst, having lived a decade of freedom and peace that the castle could never have given her. As for Hearst Castle itself, Hearst's children didn't know what to do with it. Maintaining the property cost a fortune in taxes and upkeep. Selling it was practically impossible because who could buy something so absurdly large and unique? So in 1957, the Hearst family donated the castle and grounds to the state of California on the condition that it be transformed into a historic monument open to the public. And that's what happened. Today, Hearst Castle is one of California's most visited tourist destinations, receiving nearly 1 million visitors a year. People from all over the world travel to that remote mountain, to walk the same corridors where Charlie Chaplin walked, to swim in the same pools where Hollywood stars swam, to look at the same works of art that Hearst compulsively amassed. Tour guides tell stories of legendary parties, famous guests, and absurd extravagance. They speak of Hearst as a visionary, a collector, a man who created something extraordinary. But there's a story that guidebooks rarely tell, the story that truly matters. It's the story of a man who had everything money could buy but died alone, abandoned by the people he loved, trapped in a monument to his own vanity. It's the story of how extreme wealth can become a prison, how absolute power can result in absolute isolation, how the obsession with controlling everything can lead to losing what truly matters. William Randolph Hearst built one of the most beautiful places on earth, but failed to build a meaningful life within it. He amassed treasures fit for kings, but died poor in love and genuine human connection. There is something deeply unsettling about walking through the empty halls of Hearst Castle today. The rooms are preserved exactly as they were, with the same furniture, the same tapestries, the same artwork. But there is no life there, no laughter echoing through the corridors, no music wafting from the gardens, no lively conversations in the dining room. There is only silence and the ghostly feeling that something important has been lost here, something that no amount of Italian marble or gold or Renaissance art could replace. Hearst believed that by building something big enough, luxurious enough, impressive enough, he would achieve immortality. He believed that people would talk about him for centuries, that his name would live on forever, and he was partly right. People do talk about him. Tourists visit his castle. Books are written about his life, but what they remember is not the man. It's the tragedy. They remember the warning. They remember what happens when someone confuses accumulation with achievement, when someone believes that power and possessions can replace love and human connection. There is a specific moment in Hearst's story that sums up the entire tragedy of his life. It was during his final months, when he was bedridden in Beverly Hills, too weak to move, surrounded by nurses and doctors. Marion was there, sitting beside him, holding his hand, and Hearst, his voice trembling and almost inaudible, asked her, "Do you think people will remember me? Do you think I built something that matters?" And Marion, with tears in her eyes, replied with the gentleness that always characterized her, "Of course they will remember, darling. How could they forget? But the truth they both knew, the unspoken truth that hung between them in that silent room, was that people would remember the castle, the parties, the extravagance, the power, the scandal. But would they remember the man? The real, vulnerable man who needed love and validation as much as anyone else? Probably not, because Hearst had spent his entire life hiding that man behind marble walls, sensational headlines, and ostentatious wealth. He had transformed himself into a character, a symbol, a monument, and in the process he had lost the opportunity to simply be human. Hearst Castle stands atop that mountain in San Simeon, unchanged and majestic, overlooking the Pacific Ocean as it has for nearly a century. Zebras still roam the grounds, descendants of the exotic animals Hearst imported decades ago. Greek statues still stand under the Californian sun. The pools still shimmer with blue and gold light. But the castle is no longer a home. It's a museum. It's a warning preserved in stone and marble. It's a silent reminder that no matter how big you build, how high you climb, how impressive your monument, in the end you can't take any of it with you. And if you sacrificed love and human connection in the process of building your empire, you will leave this world exactly as William Randolph Hearst left, alone, in a silent room, surrounded by wealth that can no longer buy the one thing that ever mattered, the presence of someone who truly cares. There is one last cruel irony in Hearst's story that deserves to be told. After Marion was evicted from the Beverly Hills home by Hearst's children at the time of his death, she returned to her own property and continued her life. But she kept all the letters Hearst had written to her over nearly 40 years. Hundreds of letters in which he poured out his heart, expressed his fears, revealed his vulnerability. In 1961, a few months before her own death, Marion burned all the letters, every single one of them. She watched them turn to ashes, destroying the only remaining proof of the real man who existed behind the public facade of William Randolph Hearst. When asked why she had done it, Marion simply said, "They were between us. They weren't for anyone else." And so, the last chance to know the real man vanished in smoke, leaving only the myth, the legend, the empty monument. This is the true story of Hearst Castle. It's not a story about magnificent architecture or impressive art collections. It's a story about loneliness, about the impossible price of grandeur, about how the pursuit of immortality through stone and marble can result in the loss of everything that makes life worth living. It's a story about a man who had the power to start wars with his headlines, but couldn't keep the person he loved by his side. It's a story about the emptiness that no amount of beauty or luxury can fill. And perhaps that's why people keep visiting that castle on the mountaintop, decade after decade, not just to admire the architecture or the artwork, but to feel that emptiness, to walk through the silent corridors and understand viscerally that extreme wealth without love is merely an elaborate form of poverty. To look at those empty pools and realize that all the beauty in the world cannot replace genuine human connection. To stand in those majestic halls and feel the deafening absence of real life, of real laughter, of real joy that cannot be bought or built. William Randolph Hearst dedicated nearly 3 decades of his life and an incalculable fortune to building a palace that would impress the world. And he succeeded. The world was impressed. But impression is not the same as love. Admiration is not the same as connection. And grandeur is not the same as meaning. In the end, Hearst built the most beautiful prison in the world and spent his final years locked inside, gazing through the gilded windows at a world that had moved on without him, surrounded by treasures that could not warm him, in a silence that no masterpiece of art could break. If you want to continue receiving stories that reveal what luxury hides and the price that power demands, cinematic and dark tales about extreme wealth and human decay, created to be felt and reflected upon, subscribe to the channel now. These are narratives that expose the truth behind the palaces, that show the emptiness within the mansions, that reveal the isolation at the top of the mountain. These are stories that matter because they remind us of what truly matters. And now we want to know, what city are you listening to us from? Leave a comment telling us where you're watching this story from. We want to get to know you, to know where the people interested in these profound narratives about power, wealth, and the human condition come from. Write your city in the comments.